is, I think, a prelude to strong conviction. Well said. Well said. So, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
The thing that probably creeps me out in life more than anything else is when I meet someone whose convictions seem to be founded in hatred or in bigotry or in a kind of elitism. All of these add up to the same thing for me, which is a need to take dignity away from someone else in order to create some sort of illusion of self-importance. So that's the thing that probably creeps me out about some people the most. The thing that creeps me out the most, secondly, is when I meet someone who doesn't seem to have any conviction at all. Now, I don't mean to sound hypercritical, but I think at times we give out that title of an individual a little too freely. Because there can be people who don't think for themselves to such a degree that there's not much of an individual there. They're too busy letting someone or something else think for them. An old loop of thinking out there in society, a talk show radio host perhaps, political ideology or religious ideology. Sometimes they don't think for themselves to the degree that they aren't necessarily an individual in that sense. They always can be. I was rewatching the Adam Sandler movie, The Waterboy, a couple weeks ago. Always lots of wisdom in Adam Sandler movies. But a young man who grows up in a very religious part of Louisiana, and his mom teaches him that anything that she doesn't teach him is the devil. So he's having to always overcome this idea in generally a humorous way. But don't we often have to overcome some of the old ways of thinking in order to find or discover or articulate our own conviction about life? What is life? Who am I? What do I value most? And what are those values? What do they mean? How do I describe them? How do I best support the less fortunate around me? How do I be the best myself possible? Sometimes people who don't have strong convictions, they argue, well, look, those are unanswerable questions. They're too big. Why waste any time thinking about them? And I would say that being a person of strong conviction isn't about having the right answers, but it's about a commitment to always have the conversation, to always explore, to always investigate. As the father of philosophy and wisdom, Socrates, who we'll be talking about today, said, "True wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life and ourselves and the world around us." So sometimes the biggest aha we have has to do with how little we know, doesn't it? It has to do with opening up to receiving a greater sense of knowledge and wisdom. But if we're unwilling to approach some of these bigger ideas in our lives, there's nothing wrong with coming to the conclusion that we don't know in my thinking, as long as we've given ourselves the time to at least think it through. It's when we don't think about it at all that we kind of rob ourselves of soul, that we really rob ourselves of that best opportunity we have to awaken to the idea that we're a spiritual being, or that we're connected with something greater than ourselves. Call it God or life or spirit. It's the willingness to approach and contemplate the big ideas that it helps us learn to have a relationship with them. Socrates was someone who was put on trial for investigating some of these big ideas and for asking people to think about them too, to encourage them to have convictions. It really ticked them off, so they put him to death for it. That's what they did. But he famously said to the jury in Athens, and when they had a trial in ancient Greece, it wasn't like court TV today. Everything was in one day. So they would get everything set. There'd be 501 jurors. They'd all vote, and it'd all be accomplished. But he said to all those juries at his trial, he said, "I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner, and convincing him, saying, 'O my friend, why do you who are citizens of the great and mighty and wide city of Athens care so much about laying up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Are you not ashamed of this? And so I'll be sharing a couple quotes from Socrates, all of which are good spiritual punches in my own gut for me, because this could be true of all of us, getting caught up in the materialism of things, that we forget the soul of things. We forget about the heart of our lives and asking ourselves, even if we don't have clear 100% answers, those deep and inspiring questions. Now, Socrates, I'd say, along with Jesus, are probably the most influential thinkers on the Western world. And we talk about Jesus quite a bit. I don't think in spirituality we talk about Socrates enough, but he's really the champion of thinking for yourself. He's really the champion of wisdom, and he has a lot in common with Jesus. He lived about 600 years before Jesus, but they have a lot in common. So, for example, neither had a trade or profession. They really were wanderers who wandered around and taught whoever would come around. Jesus described himself as a fisher of men. Socrates described himself as a gadfly on a horse's behind. You just can't swat it away. It's just always there, bugging you, pestering you, asking questions. Both Jesus and Socrates, they didn't struggle for any sort of payment or anything like that. They were just focused on the greater good, on just helping people. Something else that they had in common is neither Jesus or Socrates wrote anything down. We know about Jesus because people wrote these things called Gospels after he passed on, filled with stories and parables and aphorisms and wisdom sayings. Socrates never wrote down anything, and all of we know about him is carried on primarily by one of his students named Plato, who wrote these dialogues where he had these conversations. And of course, both were tried in the normal courts of the time and put to death for being committed to their beliefs. One of the most interesting, or I think poignant for today, dialogues that Socrates has is with a character named Euthyphro. And it happens just before his trial date. He's there in front of the court, and he sees this gentleman he knows named Euthyphro, and they say, "Why are you here today?" And Socrates says, "Well, I'm about to be put on trial." Euthyphro says, "Well, I'm here to put my father on trial for murder." Oh my goodness. It's a big deal, especially in Athens, because it was just kind of like today. You didn't have to testify against a family member. But what happened, Euthyphro explains, is that his father had many people working for him, and one of the workers killed another worker. And so the father had this worker, until he could deal with it, tied up, but he was outside, and the elements were so bad that it killed him. So a real awful story, but perhaps not murder with intent, right? So a little surprising that the son would be putting his father on trial. So why are you putting your father on trial? Socrates asked him. Well, because it is the pious thing to do. So here we have this idea. Here's the big idea, right? Piety. Here we have the big value, the thing that's really important to Euthyphro. And so Socrates does what Socrates does. He says, well, that's interesting because I'm about to be put on trial for myself. And Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth and for impiety, the idea of disrespecting the gods. And so, since I'm being put on trial for impiety, Euthyphro, can you tell me, what is piety anyways? Well, Euthyphro says, it's what I'm doing today. I'm putting my father on trial for murder. Pretty pious thing to do. No, Socrates says, that's an example of piety. But what is piety? Well, Euthyphro thinks about it for a time, and he says, well, piety is what is pleasing to the gods. Well, Socrates says, well, all right, that sounds pretty good, but don't the gods disagree with each other sometimes? Didn't we have the Trojan War? Don't sometimes they disagree? And of course, in ancient Greece, they believed in a lot of different gods. Well, that might be true, Euthyphro says, but I think that what is pious is something that the gods all agree upon is good. It's something all the gods love. Well, Socrates considers to think about it for a while, and he finally asks Euthyphro, well, is it pious because the gods love it, Or do the gods love it because it's pious? And so you see the gadfly analogy here. So Euthyphro at this point is not very happy. But we as readers can discover something quite important here, in that this thing that is most important to Euthyphro, this idea of piety, this thing that is so important to him that he's willing to have his father put to death for it, he in all truth has no idea what it is. He doesn't know what it is. And here's another spiritual punch in the gut for me. Because sometimes don't we live following certain virtues and values that perhaps we really don't have the idea of what they are. I know at times in my life I've followed love. Love is the most important thing in my life. And you know what love is? Love is always having a spring in your step, a whistle in your mouth, a song in your heart. So I lived believing that love was like that. And yet in a partnership, when my partner was angry or there were tears or I felt vulnerable and held in within myself, you know what happened? I got through it, but I missed out on what love really is. I love that definition or non-definition of love that the humorist James Thurber gave. He said that love is what you've been through with somebody. It's much truer than the hunky-dory. I can think of times in my life where success was the major virtue in my life. And if you would have asked me, I would have said that success is about getting lots of attention and fame and money. It's about getting all of this good stuff. And so in my life, there would be times where maybe I was failing at a business venture, but I was able to help someone in a way that other people didn't see it. Or I was able to plant seeds or ideas in my life that would grow to fruition in greater ways later on. But you know what? I missed out on them because I didn't really know what success was. I had always thought happiness was about getting things to be exactly the way I wanted them to be. So when things would turn out in ways that maybe even worked out better for me, I still missed out on happiness. Now I would say today that I still don't know perhaps what love is, or success is, or happiness is, but I know better because I'm committed to exploring. I don't let it be a guiding blind spot in my life. Strong minds discuss ideas, Socrates tells us. Aware minds discuss events. Weak minds discuss people. You see, spiritual punch in the gut, right? Which one have you been talking about most this week? And of course, Socrates is perhaps most famous for saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. As spiritual beings, we deserve that kind of attention to work into the deeper workings of ourselves, to see not only what are these great virtues that are out there in the universe, but who are we in relationship with them? What do we have to do with the expression of what those are? Our book of the month this month has been Convictions by Marcus Borg, who's a great Bible scholar who passed away earlier this year. And he said something that I found quite powerful early on in his book. He says, I have experienced an unexpected effect of turning 70. It has been interestingly empowering. In a sentence, if we aren't going to talk about our convictions, what we have learned about life that matters most, at 70, then when? And this was particularly powerful to me, being that he didn't realize he was going to pass away months later. But it speaks to the power of knowing what we think, and hopefully we're not so stuck to it. Hopefully we believe in the power of open-mindedness and changing our own minds. But there is something about believing in our own thought, taking time to think things through to where we realize that we are the central influence on what we're thinking in our lives, and that someone else who we don't know isn't doing that influencing. And Borg, in his book, he shares his experience that many of us go through with growing up with strong religiosity, with the beautiful myths and metaphors and history that comes with religiousness, which as a child, we don't distinguish the fact from the fiction. It's all true to us, right? He shares, I think of how I heard the Christmas stories when I was a child. I took for granted that they happened the way they are described in the Bible. That Mary was a virgin, though I couldn't have told you what that meant. That God was Jesus' father. That angels lit up the night skies, they sang to shepherds. That a special star led wise men to Jesus from the east with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and so forth. I remember wondering when I was 6 years old whether the Star of Bethlehem appeared every Christmas Eve. Nobody insisted that I believe all of this literally. It was effortless to do so. Believing what we learn in this state is natural. And it seems to be natural, especially in our culture, that we also move when we go into high school or college or wherever it is into that critical thinking phase, where we begin to question the differences between fact and fiction. And sometimes we get so caught up in the materialism and the science of things, we say, well, if it's a story, then it's not really factual, it's not true. So not only did Borg begin questioning the myths that he grew up with is not historical, but they also caused him to do something that naturally happens for a lot of people. Well, maybe this God person isn't real either. Maybe Jesus' message of love isn't real either. Maybe it's just all made up fairy tales. So he had to be in that space of not knowing, of moving to that way of depending on the critical thinking and the way of science, which we all know is very important, and yet there's a fork that comes in the road for many of us to either return with a new understanding to that sense of the sacred in our lives, to see that you can even have true stories that you make up, or to move that way where we live in a case of denial of the sacred if it can't be measured or proven in a physical way. And so for Borg, he has that experience. He has a mystical experience driving in his car. He says, I was driving through a sunlit rural Minnesota winter landscape alone in a 9-year-old MG 2-seater roadster. The only sounds were the drone of the car and the wind through the thin canvas top. I had been on the road for about 3 hours when I entered a series of S-curves. The light suddenly changed. It became yellowy. I like that. That's my word of the week. Yellowy. And golden. And it suffused everything I saw. The snow-covered fields to the left and right, the trees bordering the fields, and the yellow and black road signs, the highway itself. Everything glowed. Everything looked wondrous. I was amazed. It speaks to this idea of unbecoming that's in Daniel's song. Sometimes we have to give up our original understandings of what God is, what life is, what we are, to accept and be present to the understanding that can be there for us if we're open enough to receive it. Borg goes on to share, the question of God's existence is no longer about whether there is another being in addition to the universe. Rather, the question becomes, what is isness? What is? What is reality? Is it simply the space-time world of matter and energy as disclosed by ordinary sense perception and contemporary science? Or is it suffused by a radiant and glorious more? Again, a lot of the people who think that having convictions is kind of silly because you can never answer life's unanswerable questions don't realize, I think, the fact that comes in the exploring itself, that the sacred is something that reveals itself to us as we open ourselves to it, as we are willing to trust in our own experience, to trust in our own minds. We can begin to give a voice to what is sacred, to what is unseen and yet be unknowable, to be part of a divine conversation that has been happening from the beginning of time, and in a sense always will. It's in this very exploring that we often find that divine connection. So Socrates is put on trial in front of 501 jurors, and he has to answer the charges. The first is that he's corrupting the youth. And this is really ironic today because if he had seduced the youth during that time, it would have been a very acceptable thing. But he was asking them questions, and that couldn't be accepted. But Socrates, he argues against this idea. He realizes the truth is people are annoyed with him because he questions what they value most, and if they really know what that value is. That might tick me off too, right? The gadfly. Mm-hmm. He realizes that he's getting on these people's nerves. So he speaks to the idea that he's not being accused of corrupting the youth, but corrupting these adults that have to think more deeply. The second charge is that he's impious, that he doesn't believe the gods, or he's trying to create or worship some other god, and he vehemently disagrees with this idea. He shares that as a younger man he was called to see an oracle at the temple of Apollo, and that this oracle shared with Socrates that he was the wisest man and that he should dedicate his life to philosophy. And so Socrates shares, that's why I ask all these questions, because I want to be wise, because I realize I don't know. and want these people to inform me. So if I were to stop asking these questions, like that child who's always asking why, that annoys you so much, I would only then be forsaking the gods. Another powerful thing about Socrates and Jesus is they had a calling, right? So many of us have professions, and they're very important, but how many of us are really clear about our calling? It's that virtue or that value that you live from, that you come to believe in and know to be yourself more than your own name, your own tongue, your own skin. It becomes the very truth of who you are. And as we know, and I don't promote the idea of martyrdom, but for Jesus and Socrates, those values of divine love, which it was for Jesus, and divine wisdom, which it was for Socrates, became so much who they were that they weren't afraid to die for them, to give their lives for them. The jury votes on Socrates, and it's very close, but he's guilty. And so the trial goes immediately into a penalty phase. The prosecutor says death is what we should vote for, but he's doing that in kind of like they would today, saying, we'll compromise with exile or something like that, because they think that Socrates is going to do the smart thing to do, which is to say something like a fine, which is what the jury wishes he would do, but Socrates doesn't. He says that my penalty should be free room and board and to live in a mansion for the rest of my life. So he forces the jury's hand to vote guilty, and he's put to death. He has to drink the hemlock. It's this juice here. I'm not good, because I don't know what's in it, Emery. Don't be a martyr. See, I'm not going to do it. All good. Okay. So it's a wine spritzer, in other words. But even in confronting his own demise, Socrates holds to that greater truth. In looking at the idea of death, he says, no one knows whether death is really the greatest blessing a man can have, but they fear it is the greatest curse, as if they knew well. And his famous, what we know to be his last words, and now it is time to go, I to die and you to live. But which of us goes to a better thing is unknown to all but God. So not only do we have these neat little philosophical sayings about death, but we have a deeper lesson that if you commit yourself to your virtue, if you commit yourself to your value, it will give you a promise. And that promise is that it will lift you through. It will move you past any trial, any obstacle. If you give yourself to that sacred value, it returns itself to you, and you will have not only achieved your individuality, but a sense of immortality and connection with all life around you. In metaphysics, we talk about the power of conviction to set the creative medium into motion. If you speak your word with authority, the idea is there's a creative principle that responds to that authority. The other side of that is that the universe is always responding to your conviction. So do you know what the hell it is? Because it may be what you're afraid of. It may be what you're worrying about. It may be what you're trying to distance yourself or hide from. To take that time to be in your heart of hearts with what you value and hold most sacred, and to work not on defining it or putting it in a box, but exploring it and cultivating an understanding of it in your life like a garden that moves through different seasons throughout time. It will begin to expand itself in you, and you can live at one with it. What are my convictions? I believe in the sacred. I believe that the sacred is everywhere available to all people at all times if we present ourselves to it. I believe that by doing your best and being committed to being your best self, you will produce for yourself the greatest possible results. And I believe that the key to peace in our lives, peace in our time, peace in our world is good communication. Listening, sharing, conversing, participating in the endless conversation that has shared values and goals for all people, from all places and all walks of life. Will these convictions always be just as they are today? I tell you, they absolutely will not be. They will continue to evolve and grow as I grow, and as I believe the sacred grows in each of us. So recognize in closing that you have a relationship with something sacred, that you grow in it, but it also grows itself and evolves itself through you, through your willingness and commitment to what that is. So I encourage you with great conviction to commit to that sacred in you and to bring it about in your life in a more profound way. So thank you for your time, everyone, this morning.